Hey guys, tonight we step into a quiet European street, where history tilts on something as small as a wrong turn. The summer air in Sarajevo feels thick, almost sweet, and the river beside you slides along with lazy indifference, as if it has no idea it's about to carry whispers of catastrophe downstream. You stand on the Apple Quay in June 1914, watching a royal motorcade approach, polished cars glinting in the sun. Archduke Franz Ferdinand sits upright, stiff in his uniform, unaware that within minutes the world you know will begin tearing itself apart. You probably won't survive this, statistically speaking. Millions won't. But for now, you are just another pair of eyes in the crowd, heart beating a little too fast. So, before we go any further, if this quiet space makes you feel even a little less alone, you can like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Are you lying awake in a quiet room at 2 am? Or maybe starting your day in a rainy city, eyes still heavy? Drop your time and place in the comments. Let's remind each other we're not alone out here. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey together here on Timeless Sleep. You shift your weight as the motorcade rolls past. Earlier that morning, a young conspirator named Nedelko Obrinovi hurled a bomb at the Archduke's car. It bounced off the folded convertible roof and exploded beneath the next vehicle, injuring several officers. The Archduke, shaken but stubborn, insisted on continuing the visit. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief from officials who believe the danger has passed. After all, what are the odds of another assassin waiting along this same route? History, it turns out, loves odds like that. The procession moves again, but confusion ripples through the drivers. The lead car takes a wrong turn onto a side street, Franz Joseph Street, and suddenly brakes. You feel the pause, that fragile silence where destiny inhales. Coincidentally, almost absurdly, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip is standing just a few feet away outside a delicatessen. He had given up earlier, believing the chance was gone. Some say he was buying a sandwich when the car stalled before him, though historians still debate that detail. Either way, the image lingers, revolution paused for lunch, fate chewing thoughtfully. Princip steps forward. 2 shots crack through the air. You see the Archduke clutch his uniform, his wife Sophie collapsing beside him. Within minutes, both are dying. Here's the mainstream truth. Those 2 bullets set off a chain reaction that ignited World War I. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Germany offered Austria-Hungary what became known as a blank check, promising unconditional support. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. France stood by Russia. Germany declared war on Russia and France, then invaded Belgium to reach Paris, dragging Britain into the conflict. Like dominoes arranged across a continent, alliances toppled in sequence, each government convinced it was acting defensively, honourably, necessarily. You stand in that Sarajevo street and feel how something local becomes global in the blink of an eye. But the twisted decision wasn't just the assassination. It was what followed. The choice to escalate rather than de-escalate. Austria-Hungary could have treated the attack as terrorism, sought international mediation, accepted partial Serbian concessions. Instead, leaders saw an opportunity to crush Serbia and reassert fading imperial prestige. Pride, you notice, often dresses itself as strategy. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II, flamboyant and impulsive, believed a show of strength would secure his nation's place in the sun. He miscalculated how fast Russia would mobilise and underestimated Britain's commitment to Belgian neutrality. You can almost picture diplomats clutching telegrams, each convinced they are managing a crisis, not accelerating it. You wander now into a dimly lit palace room in Vienna, where officials draft an ultimatum so harsh they assume Serbia must reject it. When Serbia surprisingly accepts most of the demands, Austria-Hungary declares war anyway. The decision feels less like logic and more like momentum. Once mobilisations begin, timetables take over. Military plans, meticulously crafted, leave little room for pause. Germany's Schlieffen Plan requires immediate movement west before turning east. Rail schedules dictate destiny. It's as if Europe has built a machine too intricate to stop, and now everyone is caught in its gears. You feel the tremor spread outward. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II hesitates but orders mobilization to support Serbia. In Berlin, generals argue that mobilization equals war. France prepares. Britain watches Belgium's border. Ordinary people read headlines with a mix of dread and patriotic excitement. Some even cheer. You stand among crowds in Berlin waving flags, unaware that the cheering will curdle into trench warfare, gas attacks, and entire villages erased. In London, young men line up to enlist, imagining glory rather than mud. No one yet understands the industrial scale of what's coming. Here's a quieter, almost surreal detail. Many European leaders were cousins. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, King George V of Britain, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia were all grandchildren of Queen Victoria. They wrote to one another affectionately as Willie and Nicky in private letters, pleading for restraint even as their governments mobilised. You stand in that contradiction, family ties strained against national ambition, and realise how personal this catastrophe feels behind palace doors. It's like a group chat spiralling out of control, except the stakes are measured in continents. As July turns to August 1914, declarations of war stack up like storm clouds. Germany invades Belgium on August 4th, violating its neutrality. Britain declares war the same day. You follow German soldiers marching through Belgian towns, boots striking cobblestones with mechanical rhythm. Civilians watch in stunned silence. The war plan assumes swift victory in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. You almost smile at the optimism, knowing what they don't, that the Western Front will harden into trenches stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland, that 4 years later the map of Europe will be unrecognisable. In Sarajevo, the street looks ordinary again. The blood has been scrubbed away, shops reopen, life pretends to continue. But you can feel the invisible threads connecting this quiet river to battlefields not yet dug. The assassination becomes mythologized, simplified into cause and effect. Yet beneath it lies a web of nationalism, militarism, imperial rivalry, and alliance systems primed for ignition. The twisted decision was not merely a young man pulling a trigger. It was an entire continent choosing pride over patience. You drift now through the early weeks of war, watching soldiers board trains amid waving handkerchiefs. Flowers are tucked into rifle barrels. Newspapers promise victory by Christmas. You want to tap them on the shoulder and whisper, it won't be that simple. But history doesn't allow warnings from the future. Instead, you stand quietly as the first trenches are dug along the Marne, as machine guns redefine courage, as artillery turns fields into craters. The assassination in Sarajevo becomes distant background noise, yet it remains the spark that lit the fuse. And here's the unsettling thought you carry with you into the dark. Had the driver not taken that wrong turn, had Princip not lingered on that corner, had Austria-Hungary chosen diplomacy, had Germany withheld its blank cheque, the war might have been delayed, perhaps even avoided, at least in that form. The world in 1914 was tense, yes, but tension alone does not guarantee explosion. Decisions do. Tiny, human, fallible decisions made in rooms filled with cigarette smoke and certainty. You return once more to that sunlit street by the river. The water still flows. Birds still call from rooftops. If you close your eyes, you can almost pretend the shots never rang out. But when you open them, you see the dominoes falling, one after another, across borders and oceans. The twisted beginning of World War I feels less like fate and more like a cascade of choices, each defended, each rationalised, each nudging the world closer to unimaginable loss. And as the first cannon fire echoes in the distance, rolling like distant thunder, you realise you are standing at the edge of a new century, shaped not by inevitability, but by the fragile, combustible nature of human judgment. The wrong turn has been taken, the machine is in motion, and there is no gentle way to stop it now. The thunder you heard in the distance now rolls steadily across Europe, and you find yourself stepping into grand halls lit by chandeliers that tremble ever so slightly with the vibration of marching boots far away. The air smells of polished wood, cigar smoke, and ink drying on paper that will decide the fate of millions. In Berlin, Vienna, St. Petersburg, Paris, and London, Men in tailored uniforms and stiff collars lean over maps spread across heavy oak tables, tracing borders with gloved fingers as if the world were nothing more than a chessboard waiting for bold moves. You stand close enough to see the tension in their jaws, the confidence in their posture, and the flicker of uncertainty they try so hard to bury. This is where the blank cheques are written, not literal bank drafts, but promises of unconditional support that carry the weight of armies behind them. You drift first into a room in Berlin in early July 1914. Kaiser Wilhelm II listens as Austrian envoys explain their fury over the assassination in Sarajevo. They want to punish Serbia decisively. They want to make an example. The Kaiser, restless and eager to assert Germany's power, assures them that Germany will back Austria-Hungary no matter what. This is the infamous blank cheque, a guarantee that emboldens Vienna to issue an ultimatum designed to provoke war. You can almost hear the scratch of pen on paper as German officials confirm their support. The decision feels bold, decisive, even loyal, yet beneath it lies a profound miscalculation, the belief that Russia will hesitate, that Britain will stay neutral, that the conflict can be contained. You stand there and sense how faith in quick victory clouds sober judgment. Austria-Hungary's leaders, already anxious about the empire's fragile unity, interpret Germany's promise as a green light. They draft demands so severe that Serbia's sovereignty would be compromised entirely if accepted. When Serbia agrees to most but not all conditions, Vienna chooses war anyway. The decision is fueled by pride and fear in equal measure, fear that the empire is weakening, pride that refuses to tolerate defiance from a smaller neighbour. You watch ministers nod in agreement, convincing themselves that swift action will restore authority. No one in that room imagines trenches stretching for hundreds of miles. They imagine a short, punishing campaign that reinforces order. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II paces nervously. Russia sees itself as protector of Slavic nations, Serbia included. Advisors argue that failing to support Serbia would damage Russia's prestige and weaken its influence in the Balkans. Mobilization orders are discussed with grave seriousness. The word mobilization sounds administrative, almost harmless, but you know it is the lever that triggers war. Once millions of soldiers begin moving by rail, once timetables activate, stopping becomes nearly impossible. Nicholas hesitates, exchanging frantic telegrams with Kaiser Wilhelm, addressing him affectionately as Willie. Their messages plead for restraint even as their generals press for action. You stand between those letters and the rumble of trains, feeling how personal appeals crumble against institutional momentum. In Paris, French leaders reaffirm their alliance with Russia. The memory of losing Alsace-Lorraine to Germany decades earlier still burns quietly. France cannot afford isolation if Germany turns east. You watch French officials calculate risks, balancing honour, security and survival. They know Germany's war plan depends on striking France quickly before facing Russia's full strength. They know Belgium's neutrality may be violated, yet the alliance binds them. Breaking it would mean strategic vulnerability and diplomatic humiliation, so they commit, even as uncertainty gnaws at them. Then you move to London, where Britain faces a choice that will define its century. Officially, Britain is not bound by a formal treaty to defend France or Russia in the same way they are bound to each other, but there is Belgium. Since 1839, Britain has guaranteed Belgian neutrality. When Germany's armies prepare to march through Belgium to outflank French defences, British leaders confront a dilemma. Some argue that staying out of a continental war would preserve lives and resources. Others warn that allowing Germany to dominate Western Europe would threaten Britain's security and global empire. You stand in the cabinet room as voices rise and fall, as maps of the North Sea and Channel ports are examined. Ultimately, the decision is made: Britain will declare war if Belgium is invaded. When that invasion begins, Britain follows through. The guarantee, once abstract, becomes a declaration that pulls a global empire into conflict. You feel the weight of alliances pressing down like layers of stone. Each nation insists it is acting defensively. Germany claims encirclement by France and Russia. Russia claims obligation to Serbia. France claims loyalty to Russia. Britain claims defence of neutrality. Austria-Hungary claims preservation of imperial stability. No one says, we desire a world war. Instead, they say, we have no choice. And yet, you sense how each choice narrows the path toward peace. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's blueprint for a two-front war, is set into motion with mechanical precision. It requires rapid mobilization, swift invasion of Belgium, and a lightning strike toward Paris. The plan has been rehearsed on paper for years, refined by generals who trust in efficiency and speed. But it assumes that Russia will mobilize slowly, and that Belgium will offer minimal resistance. When Belgian forces resist more fiercely than expected, and when Britain commits troops to the continent, the timetable begins to strain. You walk alongside columns of German soldiers advancing through Belgian towns, aware that this violation of neutrality hardens British resolve and shapes global opinion against Germany. The decision to adhere rigidly to the plan, even when diplomatic alternatives still flicker, transforms a regional crisis into a continental inferno. Meanwhile, in Vienna, the assumption remains that Serbia can be subdued quickly. Yet Serbian resistance proves stubborn. The Austro-Hungarian army, stretched across multiple fronts, struggles more than anticipated. The empire's internal divisions complicate mobilization. Ethnic tensions simmer beneath the surface. You watch officers reassure one another that setbacks are temporary, that German support will compensate. The blank check has become a binding contract, tying Berlin's fate ever tighter to Vienna's ambitions. Across Europe, crowds gather in city squares. Some cheer, some weep. Newspapers trumpet patriotic slogans. You stand among them, hearing brass bands play and church bells ring. The sense of inevitability grows stronger with each headline. What began as a crisis over an assassination has become a test of national will, and yet, in quiet corners, individuals sense the danger. A few politicians and intellectuals warn that industrialized warfare will be catastrophic. Their voices are drowned out by confidence and momentum. You reflect on how quickly trust in alliances transforms into entrapment. The very systems designed to maintain balance now ensure escalation. Diplomatic flexibility evaporates once mobilization orders are issued. Railways, once symbols of progress, become arteries pumping soldiers toward battlefields. Governments fear that hesitation will signal weakness. Leaders worry that backing down will undermine credibility. Pride intertwines with strategy until neither can be separated. In Berlin, as August unfolds, officials realize Britain has declared war. Some are genuinely surprised, having assumed Britain would remain neutral. The misreading of British intentions proves costly. You stand in that realization, feeling the shift from confidence to apprehension. The war will not be confined to the Balkans. It will not be short. The blank check, once a gesture of solidarity, has widened the conflict beyond imagination. And still, beneath the grand speeches and mobilization orders, there are personal calculations, careers, reputations, legacies. Leaders consider how history will judge them. Ironically, in trying to secure greatness or stability, they set in motion events that will dismantle empires entirely. Within 4 years, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires will collapse. You can almost sense those structures trembling even now, though the men in these rooms cannot. As trains continue to depart packed with soldiers, you feel the machinery of alliance grinding forward. Each promise reinforces the next. Each declaration of support tightens the web. The blank check becomes a symbol of how unwavering loyalty, when combined with overconfidence, can distort judgment. Had Germany urged restraint instead of unconditional backing, Austria-Hungary might have reconsidered. Had Russia delayed mobilization, Germany might have paused. Had Britain signalled its intentions earlier and more clearly, calculations might have shifted. Instead, ambiguity and assumption fill the gaps. You walk once more through those ornate halls, now quieter as decisions settle into action. The maps remain spread out, but the ink has dried. Outside, soldiers march, unaware of how thoroughly their futures have been negotiated. The twisted decision here is not a single declaration, but a series of assurances given too freely. of faith placed in plans too rigid, of confidence untempered by caution. You feel the inevitability solidify, not because fate demanded it, but because leaders chose escalation over compromise at each crucial step. The thunder that began in Sarajevo now roars across continents. Alliances have transformed from safety nets into tripwires, and as you step out into the streets where banners flutter and trains whistle in the distance, you understand that the war's scale is no accident. It is the compounded result of promises made in confidence, in pride, in fear, promises that bind nations together just tightly enough to pull them all into the abyss at once. You move now with the rhythm of marching boots, westward, into a plan so meticulously crafted it feels almost elegant on paper. In Berlin's war rooms years before the first shot in Sarajevo, German generals had leaned over maps and calculated distances with mathematical devotion. The idea was simple, almost seductive. Avoid a prolonged two-front war by knocking France out quickly, then pivot east to deal with Russia. The blueprint, shaped by Count Alfred von Schlieffen and later modified by Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, depends on speed, surprise, and a sweeping right hook through neutral Belgium. You can almost see the arc traced in red pencil across northern France, curving like a scythe toward Paris. It looks decisive, it looks brilliant, it looks like it cannot possibly fail. But you know something the planners do not fully grasp. Reality resists perfection. As German forces pour into Belgium in August 1914, you walk beside columns of soldiers moving with astonishing discipline. Their uniforms are still crisp, their steps synchronized, their confidence intact. They expect to be home by Christmas. The invasion of Belgium, however, does more than open a path toward France, it hardens British resolve. Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality, and when German troops cross that border, London's declaration of war becomes inevitable. You feel the widening of the conflict like a door flung open too quickly. Belgium does not crumble as easily as anticipated. Fortified cities such as Liège resist fiercely, slowing the German advance. The delay may seem minor in hours or days, but the Schlieffen plan relies on precision. Timetables are everything. Trains must arrive on schedule, units must pivot at exact moments, supply lines must stretch, but not snap. When Belgian resistance and British expeditionary forces complicate the advance, friction sets in. You walk along dusty roads choked with soldiers, horses, artillery and supply wagons, sensing how logistics, not glory, determine outcomes. The war plan begins to fray at its edges. Meanwhile, in the east, Russia mobilizes faster than Germany expects. German planners had assumed Russia's vast size and limited infrastructure would delay its readiness. Instead, Russian armies press into East Prussia sooner than anticipated. This forces Germany to divert troops from the western offensive, weakening the very thrust meant to secure swift victory. You stand in a Berlin office as officers debate these adjustments. The decision to shift divisions east feels necessary, even prudent, yet it dilutes the force driving toward Paris. The gamble is already wobbling. As German forces sweep through northern France, panic ripples through Paris. Government officials prepare to evacuate. The city feels suspended between dread and defiance. You stand along the banks of the Seine as Parisians watch columns of refugees pass by, carts piled with belongings, faces pale with uncertainty. Yet French commanders, under General Joseph Joffre, regroup with unexpected resolve. They reorganize retreating units and prepare a counterattack along the Marne River. The German advance, stretched thin and exhausted, exposes vulnerabilities. Then comes the First Battle of the Marne in early September 1914, a turning point born from overextension. You feel the shift as French and British forces launch their counteroffensive. Taxi drivers in Paris famously ferry soldiers to the front, an almost surreal image of civilian vehicles rushing men into one of the century's defining battles. The German right wing, intended to encircle Paris, veers inward prematurely, leaving a gap between armies. Allied forces exploit it. Communication falters. Orders are delayed. Confidence wavers. The grand arc toward decisive victory falters in mud and confusion. The German retreat from the Marne is not chaotic collapse, but it marks the failure of the original plan. You sense the quiet devastation among officers who had believed so firmly in swift triumph. Instead of a quick victory, the war calcifies. Both sides race northward in what becomes known as the Race to the Sea, each attempting to outflank the other. Trenches begin to scar the landscape. Barbed wire uncoils across fields once golden with wheat. Machine guns dig in. Artillery thunders. The fluid war of movement transforms into a grinding stalemate. You stand in a trench as autumn rain turns earth into sucking mud. Soldiers huddle under damp blankets, their early enthusiasm dissolved into exhaustion. The Schlieffen Plan had not accounted for this, for months, then years of attrition. It had not envisioned a static front, where gains are measured in yards and paid for in thousands of lives. The twisted decision here lies in the rigid faith placed in a single sweeping manoeuvre, in the assumption that speed and boldness would overcome every obstacle. When reality refused to cooperate, adaptation proved slow and costly. There is a peculiar irony in how close the plan came to success. Had certain units advanced slightly faster, had communication been clearer, had Russian mobilization lagged as predicted, Paris might have fallen. You contemplate this fragility, how immense outcomes hinge on timing measured in hours. Yet history is not built on hypotheticals alone. It is shaped by the interplay of human decisions and unpredictable variables. The German High Command, unwilling to abandon its blueprint entirely, commits to holding ground rather than reconsidering strategy. Entrenchment becomes doctrine. As winter approaches, you watch both sides settle into defensive lines stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. The Western Front becomes a scar visible from the sky. Soldiers adapt to a new kind of warfare dominated by artillery barrages and machine gun nests. Poison gas will soon enter the battlefield, adding another layer of horror. None of this fits the elegant curves drawn on maps in Berlin years earlier. The plan's failure does not end the war, it transforms it into something far more destructive. Back in Germany, leaders grapple with the implications. The war will not be short. Resources must be mobilized on an unprecedented scale. Civilians will feel the strain of blockades and shortages. Industry must pivot toward armaments. The decision to pursue a rapid knockout blow has led instead to prolonged conflict that tests endurance rather than speed. You stand in a factory as workers labour through the night, forging shells that will be fired into trenches miles away. The war becomes industrial, relentless. On the Eastern Front, Germany achieves notable victories against Russia at battles such as Tannenberg, where Russian forces suffered devastating losses. Yet even these successes cannot compensate for the stalemate in the West. Two fronts demand attention, resources, and manpower. The very scenario the Schlieffen Plan sought to avoid becomes reality. You feel the weight of strategic overconfidence pressing down on every front line. The decision to invade Belgium also shapes global perception. Reports of harsh treatment of civilians circulate, influencing opinion in neutral countries. In the United States, sympathy for Belgium grows. Though America remains neutral for now, seeds of future involvement are quietly planted. You sense how one strategic shortcut, violating neutrality for speed, reverberates diplomatically far beyond immediate military objectives. In the trenches, soldiers adapt with grim humour and routine. They name rats, write letters home, and carve small comforts from misery. You crouch beside them, hearing distant artillery like rolling thunder. The war has become something its architects did not foresee, a test of stamina, technology, and national will. The twisted gamble of 1914 lies exposed. What was intended as a lightning strike has hardened into a storm that refuses to pass. As months stretch into a year, the dream of decisive manoeuvre fades. Generals search for breakthroughs, planning offensives that will cost staggering numbers of lives for minimal territorial gain. The belief in quick victory lingers stubbornly in rhetoric, but reality whispers otherwise. You walk along the trench line at dusk, watching flares arc into the sky, illuminating a wasteland between opposing sides. The elegance of the original plan has dissolved into mud and barbed wire. And so you carry forward the understanding that overconfidence in precision, in timetables, in assumptions about an enemy's weakness, can reshape the fate of continents. The gamble through Belgium was meant to secure safety and dominance. Instead, it entrenched Europe in a war of attrition that would drain empires dry. The map drawn in red pencil has been replaced by lines carved into earth, and the promise of swift triumph has given way to a long, grinding night that seems to have no clear dawn. You feel the damp salt wind before you see the shoreline, a thin grey strip rising from the Aegean like a promise half remembered. It is 1915 now, and the war that was supposed to be over by Christmas has hardened into stalemate. Trenches choke France and Belgium, and leaders search desperately for a way to break the deadlock. You stand aboard a transport ship, rocking gently in the dark, surrounded by soldiers who whisper about glory, about quick victories, about striking the soft underbelly of the Central Powers. The plan seems daring and clever. Force the Dardanelles strait, capture Constantinople, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and reopen a sea route to supply Russia. On paper, it feels almost elegant. In practice, it will become a lesson in overconfidence written in sand and blood. The architect most associated with this gamble is Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, who believes naval power can achieve what trenches cannot. You sense his restless energy even from a distance, his conviction that boldness will restore momentum. The idea begins with ships alone, battleships steaming through the narrow strait, silencing Ottoman forts, clearing mines, and sailing triumphantly toward the Ottoman capital. Naval supremacy has long been Britain's pride. Why should it fail now? You stand on the deck as massive guns fire toward distant shore batteries, the recoil shaking your bones. For a moment it feels unstoppable. But the Dardanelles are not empty water. Ottoman defences, reinforced by German advisors, are prepared. Mines drift silently beneath the surface. On March 18, 1915, several Allied battleships strike those hidden explosives and sink or are crippled. You feel the jolt through the hull, hear the chaos as sailors scramble amid smoke and listing steel. The purely naval assault falters. Yet instead of abandoning the plan, leaders double down. If ships alone cannot force the strait, then soldiers must land and secure the heights overlooking it. So you find yourself approaching the Gallipoli Peninsula before dawn on April 25th, 1915. The sky is a muted purple, the sea deceptively calm. Troops from Britain, France, Australia and New Zealand prepare to disembark. Many are young, some barely trained, their faces pale in the half-light. They have been told resistance will be minimal, that the Ottoman forces are weak and disorganised. You feel the weight of that assumption pressing down like humidity. As the first boats scrape against shore, gunfire erupts from cliffs above. The heights, far from undefended, bristle with Ottoman soldiers entrenched and ready. You scramble through shallow water, boots filling, sand sucking at your steps. Bullets snap overhead. The terrain rises steeply, rugged and unfamiliar. Units become disoriented, landing off course, pinned down by machine gun fire. The plan, so clean in briefing rooms, unravels within hours. Soldiers dig shallow trenches where they can, clinging to narrow strips of beach. The promised swift breakthrough becomes a static struggle mirroring the Western Front. Across the peninsula, similar scenes unfold. At Cape Helles, British and French forces encounter fierce resistance. Inland Ottoman commanders, including a rising officer named Mustafa Kemal, act decisively, rallying troops to hold the high ground. You stand on a ridge as Kemal reportedly tells his men he does not order them to attack, but to die, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. The determination of the defenders shocks the invaders. The assumption that the Ottoman Empire is the sick man of Europe proves dangerously simplistic. Days stretch into weeks. The beaches at Anzac Cove become cramped labyrinths of trenches carved into cliffs and gullies. Supplies are scarce. Water is rationed. Flies swarm over unburied bodies in the heat. You feel the relentless sun baking the earth, the smell of decay lingering in still air. Attempts to advance inland meet stubborn resistance. Each push costs lives for minimal gain. The campaign, intended as a bold manoeuvre to break stalemate, creates another front of attrition. In August 1915, Allied commanders launch a renewed offensive, aiming to seize the heights of Sari Bair and finally break through. For a moment, there is hope. Some units reach high ground, glimpsing the strait shimmering in the distance. But coordination falters. Reinforcements arrive too slowly. Ottoman counterattacks reclaim lost positions. Confusion and exhaustion undermine momentum. You sense frustration thickening like fog. The opportunity slips away. Back in London, political consequences ripple. Churchill's reputation suffers. Critics question the judgment behind the operation. The gamble, once hailed as visionary, now appears reckless. Yet on the peninsula itself, soldiers on both sides endure shared hardship. There are brief, almost surreal truces to bury the dead, moments when enemies exchange small gestures across no man's land. You witness how proximity humanizes even as orders dehumanize. The war's absurdity reveals itself in quiet exchanges of cigarettes or shouted greetings between trenches. Winter approaches, bringing cold rain and frost. The same beaches scorched by summer sun become muddy and bitter. Disease spreads. Morale sinks. You crouch in a trench carved into clay, listening to wind whip across the peninsula. The strategic objective, capturing the strait and aiding Russia, feels distant, abstract. Survival becomes immediate. By December 1915 and January 1916, Allied leaders concede failure. The evacuation of Gallipoli begins, conducted with surprising efficiency and minimal casualties. You board a ship under cover of darkness, leaving behind graves scattered across foreign soil. The campaign has cost over 250,000 casualties on each side. It has not broken the stalemate. It has not knocked the Ottoman Empire out of the war. Instead, it has strengthened Ottoman morale and elevated leaders who will shape the region's future. You reflect on how optimism can morph into blindness. The decision to launch the Gallipoli campaign stemmed from frustration and ambition, a desire to change the war's trajectory with a single daring stroke. Yet intelligence underestimated the defenders' resolve and terrain. Naval setbacks did not prompt reconsideration, they prompted escalation. The belief that boldness alone could compensate for complexity proved costly. The consequences ripple beyond immediate losses. In Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli becomes a defining national memory, shaping identity and remembrance. In the Ottoman lands, resistance fosters unity and pride that will influence the emergence of modern Turkey. You sense how a failed military gamble can still forge powerful narratives. As you sail away from the peninsula, cliffs receding into grey mist, you carry the image of plans drawn confidently in distant capitals, colliding with stubborn geography and human will. The beaches look almost peaceful now, waves lapping gently against sand that conceals trenches and shattered dreams. The twisted decision here was not simply to attack, but to persist in belief after warning signs appeared, to treat early setbacks as temporary inconveniences rather than signals to reassess. The wider war continues unabated. On the Western Front, artillery still roars. In the east, armies clash across vast plains. The Dardanelles remain in Ottoman hands. Russia continues to strain under pressure. The hope that a single bold stroke might restore fluidity to the conflict has dissolved like footprints in tide-washed sand. You close your eyes for a moment, feeling the ship's steady roll beneath you. The lesson lingers softly. Ambition untethered from realism can entrench disaster as firmly as any trench line. Gallipoli stands as a testament to how leaders, desperate to break stalemate, may choose risk over restraint, and how the price of that choice is paid by those who climb ashore under a pale dawn sky, believing the climb will be brief. The sea stretches wide around you now, indifferent and endless, carrying you back toward a war that has grown only more complex, more entrenched, and more resistant to the quick fixes imagined in warm rooms far from the sound of gunfire. The sea follows you, darker now, colder, stretching wide beneath a low iron sky. It is 1917, and the war has consumed years instead of months. Trenches still grip Europe, empires strain, and hunger gnaws at civilians far from the front. Britain's naval blockade tightens around Germany, restricting food and raw materials. you feel the quiet desperation in German ports where ships sit idle and shelves grow sparse. In response, German leaders reach again for a gamble, one that drifts silently beneath the waves. If they cannot break Britain's blockade on the surface, they will strike below it. Unrestricted submarine warfare becomes the weapon of choice, a decision as cold and calculated as the Atlantic itself. You stand on the deck of a German U-boat as it slips out of harbour, diesel engines rumbling softly before submerging into grey water. The submarine feels cramped, metallic, smelling of oil and sweat. Inside, young sailors move with tense efficiency. Their orders are stark: sink any vessel heading toward Allied ports, whether military or merchant. The logic is brutal but simple. Starve Britain into submission before American intervention becomes decisive. German admirals argue that if enough ships are sunk quickly enough, Britain will be forced to negotiate. They know the risk. Attacking neutral shipping could provoke the United States. Yet they calculate that America's mobilization would take too long to matter. You glide beneath the Atlantic, listening to the creak of hull plates under pressure. Periscopes rise like cautious eyes. Through one, you glimpse the silhouette of a merchant vessel on the horizon, smoke trailing from its funnels. There is no warning shot this time, no requirement to surface and allow evacuation. Torpedoes streak silently through water, an explosion shudders through steel and bone. The ship lists, then begins to sink. You watch lifeboats scatter across churning waves, tiny and fragile against the vastness. The war at sea has become merciless, driven by arithmetic tonnage sunk versus days remaining before Britain collapses. This strategy is not new. Germany had experimented with submarine warfare earlier in the conflict, most famously in 1915, when a U-boat torpedoed the British liner Lusitania, killing nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. The outrage in the United States had forced Germany to scale back attacks temporarily, issuing pledges to avoid targeting passenger ships without warning. But by 1917, with stalemate persisting and resources dwindling, German leaders decide to resume unrestricted attacks fully. They convince themselves that the United States, divided and distant, will hesitate. You sense the tension in Berlin as this decision is debated. Some officials warn that America's industrial power could tip the balance if provoked. Others argue that without drastic action, Germany will slowly suffocate under blockade. The gamble hinges on timing. If Britain can be starved before American troops arrive in force, the risk will have been worth it. If not, Germany will have awakened a giant. Back on the Atlantic, you feel the scale of the campaign intensify. Ships vanish at alarming rates in early 1917. Insurance premiums skyrocket. British civilians worry about food shortages, yet the Allies adapt. Convoy systems are introduced, grouping merchant ships under naval escort. Depth charges and improved anti-submarine tactics complicate U-boat operations. What seemed initially devastating becomes less decisive. The Atlantic turns into a vast chessboard of detection and evasion. Across the ocean, in the United States, public opinion shifts gradually but decisively. President Woodrow Wilson had campaigned on keeping America out of war, insisting on neutrality, but reports of American ships sunk and citizens killed begin to erode patience. Newspapers print stark headlines. You stand in a New York harbour as anxious families read about vessels lost at sea. The sense of distance that once insulated America from European conflict feels thinner now, like glass under strain. Then comes another twist layered atop the submarine gamble. In January 1917, Germany sends a secret telegram to Mexico proposing a military alliance if the United States enters the war. In exchange for Mexican support, Germany promises to help Mexico reclaim territories lost to the US, including Texas and Arizona. The message, intercepted and deciphered by British intelligence, is shared with Washington. You watch as American officials absorb its contents, incredulous and angered. The combination of unrestricted submarine warfare and the audacious proposal to Mexico tips the balance. On April 6, 1917, the United States declares war on Germany. You feel the shift like a tide turning. America's entry does not bring immediate victory, but it signals an immense infusion of manpower, industry, and financial support for the Allies. Factories ramp up production. Troops begin training and crossing the Atlantic in increasing numbers. The gamble that America would remain passive proves fatally flawed. Meanwhile, in Germany, the submarine campaign continues, but its strategic edge dulls. Convoys reduce losses. American shipyards produce vessels faster than U-boats can sink them. The arithmetic that once seemed promising now works against Germany. You stand again inside a submarine, this time sensing a creeping doubt among the crew. The early thrill of success has faded into grim endurance. The ocean feels less like a hunting ground and more like a trap. The human cost accumulates quietly. Sailors vanish beneath waves without graves. Merchant seamen risk their lives carrying grain and coal. Civilians ration food, scanning horizon lines for ships that may never arrive. The Atlantic becomes both battlefield and barrier, shaping economies and morale alike. The decision to unleash unrestricted submarine warfare was born of desperation, yet it accelerates the very outcome Germany hoped to avoid. You reflect on how leaders weighed probabilities in smoky rooms, calculating tonnage and timelines. They believed the war's stalemate justified extraordinary measures. In many ways, they were correct that something drastic was needed to break the impasse. But they underestimated the industrial and emotional response of the United States. They misjudged how submarine attacks on neutral shipping would unify American opinion rather than intimidate it. As 1918 approaches, American troops begin arriving on the Western Front in significant numbers. Their presence bolsters Allied morale and stretches German resources thinner. The submarine gamble, intended to secure victory, instead contributes to Germany's eventual defeat. You sense the irony settle like mist over the sea. A strategy designed to starve an enemy has fed a new coalition. And yet, beneath the cold calculations, there is the strange intimacy of submarine warfare. Sailors on both sides share the same vast ocean, the same vulnerability to depth and darkness. You imagine the quiet tension inside a submerged vessel, the careful listening for propellers overhead, the knowledge that a single miscalculation can implode steel and flesh alike. War beneath the waves feels almost detached from politics, yet it is politics that sends these vessels out to hunt. As you rise once more to the surface, grey light spreading across endless water, you understand how desperation can narrow vision. Germany's leaders faced blockade, hunger, and stagnation. They chose a weapon that promised swift results. For a few months it seemed effective, but the wider consequences, diplomatic outrage, American mobilization, technological countermeasures, outpaced the initial gains. The Atlantic remains vast and indifferent, swallowing wreckage and memory alike. Ships continue to sail, escorted now in guarded clusters. The gamble has failed to force Britain's surrender. Instead, it has widened the war's scope beyond Europe. You watch as American troops disembark in France, their uniforms fresh, their optimism still intact. The ocean that once seemed a protective moat has become a highway of intervention. And as waves roll endlessly beneath a muted sky, you feel the weight of that twisted decision echo across continents. A reminder that strategies forged in desperation can ripple outward in ways no admiral's chart can fully predict. You step out of the Atlantic winds and into a quiet, dimly lit room, thick with cigarette smoke and the faint crackle of telegraph wires. The war is grinding into its third brutal year, and while armies clash in mud and steel, another battle unfolds in code and paper. You sit at a wooden desk in London in early 1917, where British intelligence officers lean over intercepted cables, their fingers stained with ink and impatience. Among the thousands of messages flowing through underwater telegraph lines, one particular transmission catches their attention. It is encrypted, formal, and seemingly routine, yet it carries within it a gamble so audacious it will tilt the war's balance yet again. The message originates in Berlin, sent by German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico. You imagine the moment it was drafted, Germany, already committed to unrestricted submarine warfare, anticipating that the United States may soon declare war in response. If America enters the conflict, Germany hopes to distract and weaken it by opening another front closer to home. The proposal is bold in its simplicity. Encourage Mexico to join the war against the United States. promising in return support for reclaiming territories lost decades earlier, including Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The logic rests on the assumption that resentment and ambition can be ignited across borders. You watch as British codebreakers in Room 40 painstakingly decrypt the message. Each translated phrase sharpens the room's tension. They understand immediately what they have found. Not just a diplomatic manoeuvre, but a spark capable of inflaming American opinion. Yet they face a dilemma. Revealing the telegram risks exposing their code-breaking capabilities, which depend on secrecy and access to German communications. Concealment protects intelligence advantages. Disclosure could bring the United States fully into the war. You feel the weight of that choice pressing against the walls. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Woodrow Wilson still clings to cautious neutrality. Though unrestricted submarine warfare has angered Americans, there remains hesitation about entering a European conflict. Many citizens believe the ocean should shield them from old-world entanglements. You stand outside the White House as winter light fades early, sensing the unease of a nation caught between outrage and reluctance. The telegram, once revealed, will harden that uncertainty into resolve. British officials decide to share the decoded message with the United States, but carefully. They craft a narrative that conceals the true source of their intelligence. When the contents reach Washington in late February 1917, disbelief ripples through American leadership. The proposal seems almost fantastical, Germany urging Mexico to wage war against its northern neighbour while promising territorial spoils. Yet the authenticity of the telegram is undeniable. Even more startling is Zimmermann's own public confirmation of its legitimacy when questioned. You feel the collective intake of breath across the country as newspapers print the story in bold headlines. In Mexico City, officials examine the proposal with caution. Mexico is still reeling from its own revolution, economically strained and militarily unprepared for war with the United States. Leaders quietly conclude that the risks outweigh the rewards. Even if Germany were victorious in Europe, its ability to deliver on territorial promises seems doubtful. You sense how the plan rests on layers of improbability, a Germany triumphant despite mounting pressures, a Mexico capable of reclaiming vast territories, and America divided enough to falter. Each assumption adds fragility to the gamble. Yet in the United States, the impact is immediate and profound. Public opinion, already inflamed by submarine attacks, now shifts decisively. The notion that Germany would conspire to undermine American sovereignty feels like a direct affront. You stand in a crowded newsroom as editors rush to press, sensing the electric mix of anger and disbelief. Isolationist arguments lose traction. Wilson, who had spoken of peace without victory, now addresses Congress with solemn resolve. On April 2, 1917, he asks for a declaration of war, framing it as a defense of democracy and international order. 4 days later, Congress complies. You feel the atmosphere change almost palpably. Factories hum louder. Recruitment offices fill. Posters appear urging enlistment and bond purchases. The war, once distant, becomes immediate. The telegram, a few paragraphs of coded text, has helped tip a vast nation into global conflict. It is not the sole cause. Submarine warfare and broader tensions play their roles, but it acts as catalyst, clarifying ambiguity into action. Back in Berlin, officials likely anticipated some reaction, but perhaps not this scale. The gamble had been intended as a contingency, a distraction if American entry proved unavoidable. Instead, it accelerates that entry. You imagine Zimmermann reflecting on the fallout, aware that a message meant to secure advantage has backfired spectacularly. It is a reminder that secrecy and strategy often unravel once exposed to public scrutiny. On the Western Front, the arrival of American troops begins slowly but steadily. At first, their numbers are modest, their training incomplete, yet their presence signals industrial and demographic power that Germany cannot easily counter. You walk along a French railway platform as fresh-faced American soldiers disembark, greeted by weary Allied troops who see in them renewed hope. The telegram's echo resounds here in muddy boots and unfamiliar accents. The broader war continues unabated. Russia, meanwhile, teeters toward revolution, its armies exhausted and morale collapsing. The irony deepens. Germany had hoped to destabilize America. Instead, it has helped solidify American resolve while its eastern adversary edges toward withdrawal from the war. History's balance tilts unpredictably, shaped by choices that seem logical in isolation, but volatile in combination. You consider how the telegram reveals the interconnectedness of global politics. A message sent from Berlin to Mexico City, intercepted in London, published in Washington, reverberates across trenches in France. The modern world, bound by cables and print, transforms secrecy into spectacle. Once the text is public, it becomes more than diplomacy, it becomes narrative. And narratives move nations. There is something almost surreal about how such a concise proposal can carry such weight. No armies marched within its lines, no ships fired torpedoes, yet it mobilized millions. It exposed assumptions about American passivity and Mexican ambition. It underestimated the power of public opinion once confronted with perceived betrayal. As you walk through Washington streets lit by early spring sun, you sense the final fading of neutrality. The ocean no longer feels like insulation. Instead, it is a conduit for troops and material. The decision to send the telegram, layered atop unrestricted submarine warfare, stands as one of the war's most consequential diplomatic miscalculations. It did not create hostility out of nothing, but it crystallized it. And so you carry forward the image of that dim London room, where codebreakers pieced together fragments of text, unaware perhaps of how profoundly their work would alter the war's trajectory. The twisted decision here lies in overreaching, in believing that distant nations can be manipulated without consequence, that bold proposals remain safely hidden. Instead, the message surfaced, clear and undeniable, reshaping alliances and accelerating involvement. As American soldiers train under open skies and ships prepare to cross the Atlantic, you feel the quiet inevitability of change. The war has widened once more, not through artillery or trenches this time, but through ink and encryption. A telegram meant to divide has united, and its reverberations will be felt in every step taken by the armies, now assembling for the battles still to come. You feel the ground change beneath your boots, hard earth giving way to endless fields stretching toward a horizon that seems too wide to conquer. The year is 1941 now, and another war, even larger and more mechanized than the last, has engulfed the world. You stand on the eastern edge of Europe as German forces assemble in staggering numbers along the Soviet border. Tanks idle in long steel lines, aircraft wait on makeshift airstrips, soldiers adjust packs with a mixture of confidence and impatience. The operation is called Barbarossa, and it is driven by a conviction so fierce it drowns out caution. Adolf Hitler has decided to turn east and invade the Soviet Union, despite an existing non-aggression pact signed less than 2 years earlier. The decision feels enormous, almost mythic in scale, a gamble that will stretch across thousands of miles and test the limits of men and machines alike. You sense the confidence coursing through German command. France has fallen. Western Europe lies subdued. Britain stands defiant, but isolated. Hitler believes the Soviet Union is a colossus with feet of clay, weakened by purges within its officer corps and crippled by ideological rot. He is convinced that a swift, crushing campaign will destroy Soviet resistance before winter, securing Lebensraum, living space, and vast resources in the east. The plan echoes the overconfidence of earlier wars: speed, surprise, encirclement. 3 massive army groups will surge forward, one toward Leningrad, one toward Moscow, and one toward Ukraine. The scale dwarfs anything Europe has yet seen. Nearly 3 million Axis troops prepare to cross the frontier. On June 22, 1941, the invasion begins. You feel the shock of artillery pounding across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Aircraft roar overhead, bombing airfields and infrastructure. Soviet forces, caught off guard despite numerous warnings, reel under the initial assault. Entire divisions are encircled and captured in the opening weeks. The speed of the advance seems to confirm German expectations. You stand amid columns of prisoners trudging westward, stunned and exhausted. It appears for a fleeting moment that the gamble is working. Yet beneath the early victories lies a creeping problem of scale. The Soviet Union is vast beyond imagination. Roads are poor, distances immense. Supply lines stretch thinner with every mile gained. You ride atop a German supply truck, bouncing along rutted tracks, dust coating your throat, fuel dwindling faster than anticipated. The further east the armies push, the more strained logistics become. The blitzkrieg that shattered Poland and France begins to slow against geography itself. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Joseph Stalin absorbs reports of invasion with disbelief that borders on paralysis. Despite intelligence from multiple sources warning of imminent attack, he had clung to the hope that the non-aggression pact would hold at least a little longer. The shock is profound. For days, confusion grips Soviet command. Yet gradually, the machinery of Soviet resistance awakens. Factories begin relocating eastward beyond the Ural Mountains, dismantled piece by piece and transported by rail to continue production out of German reach. You watch entire industrial complexes uprooted and reassembled, an extraordinary feat of determination and organisation. As summer advances, German forces press deeper. Kliv falls, Smolensk is taken, army group centre edges toward Moscow. Confidence surges again within the German high command. Yet Hitler intervenes repeatedly in strategic decisions, diverting armoured units south toward Ukraine instead of concentrating entirely on Moscow. The debate between seizing economic resources and capturing the Soviet capital reveals fractures in planning. You sense how ambition and ideology cloud clarity. Every diversion consumes time, and time on the Eastern Front is an adversary as formidable as any army. Autumn arrives with rain that transforms roads into seas of mud, the infamous Rasputitsa. Vehicles bog down, horses strain against wagons, tanks struggle to manoeuvre. You stand ankle-deep in muck, hearing engines whine in frustration. The timetable envisioned for Barbarossa unravels in slush and exhaustion. Winter looms closer than planners had allowed. By October, German forces approach Moscow's outskirts. The city prepares defences with frantic urgency. Civilians dig trenches. Government offices evacuate east. Yet, Soviet resistance stiffens. Reinforcements from Siberia, freed after intelligence confirms Japan will not attack from the east, arrive to bolster the defence. You feel the temperature drop sharply as November gives way to brutal cold. German soldiers, equipped for a short summer campaign, shiver in inadequate uniforms. Weapons jam in freezing conditions. Frostbite spreads quietly through ranks. The decision to invade the Soviet Union before securing victory against Britain now reveals its peril. Germany is once again fighting a two-front war, the very scenario strategists had once feared. The vastness of the East consumes divisions at an alarming rate. Casualties mount into the millions. You walk across a snow-covered field littered with abandoned equipment, the silence broken only by distant artillery. The initial lightning strike has become a grinding struggle for survival. In December 1941, Soviet forces launch a counter-offensive near Moscow. Fresh troops, acclimated to winter, push exhausted German units back from the capital. The myth of invincibility fractures. You feel the psychological shift ripple through command structures. Barbarossa has not delivered decisive victory. Instead, it has opened a front that will devour resources and lives for years. Beyond the battlefield, the invasion hardens ideological hatred into something genocidal. Einsatzgruppen follow advancing armies, carrying out mass killings of Jews, political commissars and civilians. The brutality of the Eastern Front escalates into a war of annihilation. You sense how the decision to invade is intertwined with racial ideology, transforming strategic calculation into catastrophic cruelty. The industrial might of the Soviet Union, once underestimated, begins to assert itself. Tanks roll off assembly lines relocated far from German bombers. Manpower reserves seem inexhaustible. The Soviet government frames the conflict as a great patriotic war, galvanizing national unity. You stand in a factory lit through the night, workers assembling T-34 tanks despite freezing temperatures. The scale of mobilization dwarfs expectations. Hitler's refusal to allow tactical retreats further compounds the problem. Orders to hold ground at all costs trap divisions in untenable positions. The pattern of overreach becomes clear. What was envisioned as a swift conquest transforms into a war of attrition on a scale surpassing even the trenches of the First World War. You look back at that June morning when the invasion began, at the confidence etched into faces of officers studying maps. The gamble rested on assumptions about Soviet weakness, about speed conquering space, about ideology overpowering logistics. Each assumption contained fragments of truth, but ignored the resilience and capacity of the adversary. By the end of 1941, Germany faces not a defeated Soviet Union, but a mobilized giant determined to survive. The Eastern Front stretches endlessly, swallowing divisions. The decision to turn east too soon, before Britain was subdued, before resources were secure, becomes one of the war's defining miscalculations. It binds Germany to a conflict it cannot easily escape. As snow falls quietly over vast plains, you feel the weight of that choice settle like frost. The gamble that promised empire now promises endurance without guarantee. The war has widened again, deeper and colder than before, and you stand in the silence of winter, aware that the road east, once taken with such confidence, has no simple path back. You trade the frozen silence of the Eastern Front for warm, humid air that clings to your skin like a warning. It is December 1941, and you stand on the deck of an aircraft carrier cutting quietly through the Pacific before dawn. Around you, sailors move in rehearsed silence, faces lit faintly by red lamps, the sea stretching black and endless in every direction. The plan has been months in the making, shaped in secret meetings in Tokyo, where leaders debated how to secure Japan's ambitions in Asia without provoking a war they could not win. Yet that is precisely what they are about to do. The decision feels like a blade poised over water, swift, decisive, and irreversible. Japan's expansion across East Asia has already brought it into brutal conflict with China and into tension with Western powers. The United States, alarmed by Japanese advances and the occupation of French Indochina, has imposed economic sanctions and an oil embargo. Oil is lifeblood for ships and planes. Without it, Japan's military machine will grind to a halt. You can sense the urgency in Tokyo's calculations. Leaders face a stark choice: withdraw from conquered territories and compromise ambitions, or strike boldly to neutralize American power in the Pacific long enough to secure resources from Southeast Asia. They convince themselves that a sudden, devastating blow will shatter American morale and buy time to fortify a defensive perimeter. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who understands America's industrial capacity better than many of his peers, warns that Japan can run wild for 6 months to a year, but cannot guarantee success beyond that. His caution is noted, yet the plan moves forward. You stand on the carrier Akagi as aircraft engines warm softly in the darkness. Pilots review their targets, battleships lined up at Pearl Harbor, airfields on Oahu, fuel depots and infrastructure meant to cripple the US Pacific Fleet. The element of surprise is paramount. Diplomacy continues in Washington even as the strike force closes in on Hawaii. The morning of December 7 breaks clear and bright over Pearl Harbor. You stand on the shore as sailors begin routine Sunday tasks, unaware of what approaches from the north. Then you hear it, the distant drone of aircraft engines growing louder, unnatural in its intensity. The first bombs fall at 7:48 a.m. Explosions ripple across the harbor. Battleships erupt in flames. The US Arizona suffers a catastrophic detonation that splits it apart, sending smoke and debris high into the air. You feel the shockwave in your chest, the sky filling with black plumes. Within minutes, the base is chaos. Sirens wail, anti-aircraft guns fire desperately, sailors scramble to fight fires and rescue trapped comrades. The attack unfolds in 2 waves, meticulously timed and executed. Japanese pilots strike with precision, crippling or sinking 8 battleships and damaging numerous other vessels and aircraft. More than 2,400 Americans are killed. The harbour, once serene, becomes a burning tableau of twisted steel and oil-slicked water. You wade through smoke and confusion, hearing shouted orders and the crackle of flames consuming wood and paint. Yet amid the devastation, there are critical oversights. American aircraft carriers, primary targets in Yamamoto's strategy, are not in port that morning. They remain at sea, untouched. Fuel storage facilities and repair yards also escape major damage. These omissions will prove decisive. The blow is severe, but not crippling enough to eliminate American naval capacity in the Pacific. You sense how thin the margin is between decisive victory and strategic miscalculation. In Washington, news of the attack spreads rapidly. Shock turns to fury. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addresses Congress the next day, calling December 7 a date which will live in infamy. You stand in the chamber as lawmakers listen in stunned silence, then rise in unified support for a declaration of war. Isolationist arguments evaporate overnight. The attack has achieved tactical surprise but strategic catastrophe for Japan. Rather than deterring American involvement, it galvanizes it. Within days, Germany and Italy declare war on the United States, formalizing the global scale of the conflict. The industrial giant Yamamoto feared now mobilizes fully. Factories shift to wartime production at astonishing speed. Shipyards launch vessels faster than Japan can sink them. You walk through an American factory floor where workers assemble aircraft and tanks in endless lines, the rhythm of machinery echoing resolve. Meanwhile, Japan advances rapidly across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, capturing the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. For a time, the gamble seems to yield territorial gains. You stand on tropical beaches as Japanese troops plant flags, confident that the defensive perimeter they envision will deter counterattack. Yet beneath this momentum lies a ticking clock. America's industrial output dwarfs Japan's capacity. The loss of surprise means that future battles will be fought against a fully awakened adversary. Back at Pearl Harbor, salvage crews labour to raise sunken ships. Some battleships are eventually repaired and returned to service. The harbour, scarred but not destroyed, becomes a symbol of resilience. You feel the transformation in American mood, from complacency to determination. Recruitment surges. War bonds fund massive expansion. The Pacific, once distant in public imagination, becomes central to national focus. The twisted decision here lies in believing that a single dramatic strike could secure long-term advantage against a nation with immense resources. Japanese leaders hoped to negotiate from a position of strength after inflicting shock. Instead, they united a previously divided society and ensured a prolonged war. Yamamoto himself reportedly reflects that he fears he has awakened a sleeping giant and filled it with terrible resolve. As 1942 unfolds, the consequences begin to manifest. At Midway, American forces sink 4 Japanese carriers in a decisive battle that shifts momentum irreversibly. You stand on a carrier deck once more, this time watching aircraft roar into the sky under American insignia. The tables turned. The strategic initiative slips from Japan's grasp. Yet on that bright December morning, none of this is certain. You stand amid smoke and twisted metal, feeling how history pivots in hours. The decision to strike Pearl Harbor was calculated, debated, and executed with discipline. It achieved immediate tactical success, but it underestimated the depth of American response and the power of industrial mobilization. As the sun sets over a harbour still smouldering, you watch oil shimmer on water like fractured mirrors. The shock has passed into resolve. The Pacific War, once a regional conflict, now becomes a vast struggle stretching from island to island. The gamble that aimed to secure empire has instead guaranteed relentless opposition. And as night falls over Hawaii, cool air replacing the day's heat, you sense how that single morning has redrawn the map of global war. The silence before dawn has given way to years of conflict. The calculated risk has become a turning point from which there is no retreat, only escalation across oceans and continents alike. You return now to the vast eastern plains, but this time you stand not at the moment of invasion, but in the uneasy weeks before it, when silence hangs heavy with denial. It is early 1941 in Moscow, and the city hums with its usual stern rhythm, factories clanking, trams rattling, officials moving briskly through corridors lined with portraits and slogans. Yet beneath the surface, warnings are arriving from every direction. British intelligence passes along reports that Germany is amassing troops along the Soviet border. Soviet spies embedded deep within Europe relay similar messages. Even intercepted German communications hint at something enormous taking shape. You stand in a dim Kremlin office as dispatches pile up, each one suggesting the same chilling possibility: invasion is imminent. And still, Joseph Stalin refuses to believe it. The Non-Aggression Pact signed in 1939 between Germany and the Soviet Union had been a shock to the world. It divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence and bought Stalin precious time to rebuild his military after devastating purges of the officer corps. That time, he believed, would last longer. Hitler, in Stalin's calculation, would not risk a two-front war while Britain remained unconquered. It seemed logical enough. You watch as advisors approach Stalin cautiously, presenting evidence. He listens, his expression unreadable, then dismisses the warnings as provocations or misinformation designed to sow distrust between Moscow and Berlin. To mobilize prematurely, he fears, might give Germany the pretext it needs to attack. The irony presses against you like thick air. The very caution meant to avoid escalation becomes paralysis. Border commanders request permission to put troops on full alert. Some are granted partial measures, others are told to stand down to avoid provoking German forces. Soviet units remain clustered in vulnerable positions, aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip on airfields, ammunition stored without adequate dispersal. You walk along a frontier airstrip in June 1941, feeling the uneasy quiet. Soldiers sense tension, but receive no clear directive. When Operation Barbarossa begins on June 22, the shock is total. German artillery pounds Soviet positions across a front stretching nearly 1,800 miles. Aircraft sweep in low, destroying hundreds of Soviet planes on the ground in the first hours. You feel the ground tremble as bombs detonate, smoke rising in black columns. Entire divisions are encircled before they fully comprehend what is happening. The scale of the assault overwhelms command structures already strained by fear of acting without authorization. In Moscow, Stalin initially retreats into stunned silence. For days he withdraws from public view, grappling with the magnitude of betrayal. The leader who had centralized power so completely now confronts the consequences of misjudgment. You stand outside the Kremlin as rumors ripple through the city. Some fear the government may collapse. Others brace for evacuation. Yet slowly, Stalin re-emerges, delivering a radio address that reframes the invasion as a patriotic struggle for survival. The Great Patriotic War begins in earnest. The cost of those initial days is staggering. German forces capture hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers in massive encirclements at places like Minsk and Smolensk. You walk through columns of prisoners stretching for miles, their faces hollow with disbelief. The Red Army appears shattered. Observers across Europe assume the Soviet Union will fall within months. Hitler's confidence grows, reinforced by these early successes. Yet beneath the surface of collapse, something else is stirring. Soviet resilience begins to harden. Orders are issued to relocate industries eastward, beyond the reach of German bombers. Entire factories are dismantled and transported by rail across thousands of miles. You watch workers labour day and night to reassemble machinery in the Urals and Siberia, continuing production under primitive conditions. The state mobilizes resources with ruthless efficiency. Harsh discipline enforces resistance. Retreat without orders can mean execution. The price of survival is severe. The decision to ignore warnings had nearly cost the Soviet Union its existence, but the vastness of its territory becomes both curse and shield. German supply lines stretch thin as they advance. Soviet scorched earth tactics deny resources to the invaders. Villages burn. Crops are destroyed. The land itself seems to resist occupation. You trudge through fields reduced to ash, feeling how geography conspires with endurance. As autumn approaches, the German advance slows. The timetable envisioned by Berlin frays under mud and distance. Soviet forces, though battered, regroup around key cities. Leningrad is besieged, enduring unimaginable hardship. Moscow braces for assault. You stand in the capital as civilians dig trenches and anti-tank ditches, fear mingling with determination. The earlier paralysis has transformed into fierce resolve. The psychological dimension of Stalin's decision lingers. His distrust of intelligence, shaped by years of paranoia and purges, had dulled his response. Officers feared bringing him bad news. Reports that contradicted his expectations were often dismissed. You sense how centralized power can create echo chambers where inconvenient truths fade into background noise. The invasion shatters that illusion, forcing adaptation under extreme pressure. In December 1941, as German troops approach Moscow, winter descends with merciless cold. Soviet reinforcements, some transferred from Siberia after assurances that Japan will not attack from the east, counterattack. German forces, unprepared for the severity of winter, falter. The Soviet defence of Moscow marks a turning point. The initial disaster does not become final defeat. You reflect on the narrow margin between annihilation and endurance. Had Stalin heeded earlier warnings, mobilised fully, and dispersed forces, the opening blows might have been less catastrophic. Yet premature mobilisation carried its own risks in his mind. The twisted decision here lies not only in disbelief, but in the rigid confidence that assumptions outweigh evidence. Across the vast front, the war deepens into brutality beyond precedent. Cities become battlegrounds. Civilians endure starvation and siege. The scale dwarfs previous conflicts. Yet the Soviet Union does not collapse. Instead, it absorbs punishment and prepares for prolonged resistance. The early gamble of denial becomes a catalyst for transformation. You stand once more in that Kremlin office months after the invasion began. Maps are marked with red and blue arrows, shifting lines of advance and retreat. The mood is no longer complacent, it is grim, focused. Stalin listens more intently now to military advisors. The cost of misjudgment has burned away illusions. The story of those early weeks lingers like a bruise on history. Warnings ignored, intelligence discounted, mobilization delayed. Each choice compounded vulnerability. And yet survival emerged from catastrophe. The Soviet Union, nearly broken by surprise, hardened into one of the war's decisive forces. As snow settles over the eastern plains once more, you feel the weight of that lesson. Leadership rooted in certainty can falter when reality shifts unexpectedly. Denial may buy temporary calm, but it cannot halt advancing armies. And in the silence before artillery roars, the refusal to see what approaches can prove as dangerous as any enemy force massed beyond the horizon. You feel the rush of wind before you see the ground, the roar of aircraft engines vibrating through your ribs as the door of the transport plane yawns open to reveal a patchwork of Dutch fields below. It is September 1944, and after the long grind through Normandy and across France, momentum seems finally to favour the Allies. Paris has been liberated. German forces retreat toward their borders. Confidence swells among commanders who sense that one bold stroke might end the war before Christmas. The plan is audacious, elegant in its ambition, seize a series of key bridges in the Netherlands using airborne troops, then drive armoured columns across them in a rapid thrust into Germany's industrial heartland. The operation is called Market Garden, and it feels like a gambler's throw of the dice at a moment when victory appears within reach. You stand among paratroopers checking their gear, faces streaked with camouflage, helmets strapped tight. They have been told the drop will be swift, resistance light, objectives clear. Intelligence suggests German forces in the area are scattered and disorganised. The airborne divisions will secure bridges over rivers and canals at Eindhoven, Nijmegen and finally Arnhem. Once these crossings are held, British XX Corps will race north along a narrow corridor, linking up with the airborne units and crossing the Rhine into Germany. It is a plan that relies on precision, timing, and the assumption that the enemy is weaker than it truly is. The skies fill with hundreds of aircraft and gliders, an armada of canvas and steel. You step into the open air, parachute snapping above you as fields rise rapidly beneath your boots. For a moment, it feels almost serene, drifting down through soft September light. Then, gunfire cracks upward from below. Some units land off target, scattered by wind and confusion. Radios malfunction. Communication falters, yet many paratroopers regroup quickly, pushing toward their objectives with determination. In Eindhoven and Nijmegen, initial success comes more readily. Bridges are captured or secured after fierce fighting. Civilians cheer from doorways, waving flags and offering water and flowers. You walk through streets where hope surges in tandem with gunfire. The sense of liberation is tangible, intoxicating. Yet the final objective at Arnhem proves far more formidable. Intelligence had underestimated the presence of German armoured units refitting nearby, including elements of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions. These seasoned troops respond swiftly, encircling British airborne forces attempting to hold the Arnhem Bridge. You move through shattered houses along the Rhine as British paratroopers dig in, awaiting relief that seems perpetually just out of reach. They hold the northern end of the bridge against repeated assaults, their numbers dwindling, ammunition running low. Meanwhile, the ground advance of XXX Corps faces delays. The narrow road designated for their push becomes a bottleneck. German counterattacks sever the corridor repeatedly. Each destroyed tank or stalled vehicle blocks progress for those behind. The entire operation hinges on speed, yet speed proves elusive. Rain begins to fall, turning fields to mud and complicating resupply efforts. Airdrops intended for surrounded troops at Arnhem often fall into German hands. You watch parachutes descend beyond friendly lines, supplies drifting tantalizingly out of reach. The frustration deepens as days pass. The paratroopers at Arnhem, isolated and outnumbered, endure relentless pressure. Casualties mount. The promised swift link-up does not materialise. Back in Allied headquarters, debates simmer. Some commanders argue that the plan was overly ambitious from the start, stretching resources thin and relying on optimistic intelligence assessments. Others insist that boldness was necessary to exploit German weakness after the Normandy breakout. You sense the tension between caution and daring, between incremental progress and decisive risk. The decision to attempt Market Garden reflects a desire to avoid the prolonged attritional battles that had defined much of the war, yet the gamble exposes vulnerabilities instead. By late September, it becomes clear that Arnhem cannot be held. Survivors withdraw across the Rhine under cover of darkness, leaving behind many captured or killed. The phrase "a bridge too far" begins to circulate quietly, encapsulating the painful recognition that ambition outran capacity. The Rhine remains uncrossed. Germany's western defences, though strained, remain intact. The human cost is stark. Thousands of airborne troops are killed, wounded, or captured. Dutch civilians who had openly supported the Allies face harsh reprisals. The liberation that seemed imminent for the Netherlands is delayed, leading to a bitter winter of hardship known as the Hunger Winter. You walk through a Dutch village months later, sensing the lingering weight of hope deferred. The twisted decision at the heart of Market Garden lies in the belief that the enemy was too weakened to mount effective resistance, that speed could compensate for stretched supply lines and limited contingency planning. Intelligence warnings about German armoured units near Arnhem were downplayed. The narrow corridor chosen for the ground advance allowed little flexibility. Each component depended precariously on the others succeeding without delay. Yet you also feel the context of that choice. After years of brutal warfare, the prospect of ending the conflict sooner carried enormous appeal. Every month saved could mean thousands of lives spared. The gamble was not born of recklessness alone, but of urgency and optimism. Victory seemed within grasp. The question was whether to inch forward cautiously or leap boldly. As autumn deepens into October, Allied forces regroup. The front stabilises short of the Rhine. Germany, though battered, retains the capacity to resist fiercely. The war in Europe will continue into the following year, culminating only after further immense battles and sacrifices. Market Garden becomes a lesson etched into memory, a reminder that even in moments of advantage, overreach can stall momentum. You stand once more on the banks of the Rhine, water flowing steadily beneath grey skies. The bridge at Arnhem stands scarred but intact, a silent witness to ambition and loss. The fields around it are quiet now, save for the rustle of wind through grass. It is difficult to imagine the chaos that unfolded here, the parachutes blossoming in the sky, the desperate defence of a single crossing point. The decision to attempt this daring thrust reveals the thin line between visionary strategy and costly miscalculation. Plans drawn with confidence in headquarters can falter against stubborn resistance and unpredictable variables. Speed is a weapon, but it is also fragile. When it falters, the consequences ripple outward. As you walk away from the river, boots crunching softly on gravel, you carry with you the understanding that even near victory, the temptation to force an ending can backfire. The road to Germany remains contested. The war's conclusion will require endurance once more, not a single bold leap, but sustained pressure across multiple fronts. And so the gamble at Market Garden lingers in the air like autumn mist, a testament to courage and misjudgment intertwined, to hope that soared from aircraft doors and fell into fields where reality proved more stubborn than maps had promised. You feel winter tightening its grip again, but this time the cold settles over dense forests and winding roads in the Ardennes, where frost clings to pine branches and fog hangs low between hills. It is December 1944, and many Allied soldiers believe the war in Europe is entering its final chapter. German forces have been pushed back to their own borders. Supply lines stretch confidently from the beaches of Normandy deep into France and Belgium. There is talk of being home by spring. You stand in a quiet sector of the front where inexperienced American units hold positions along a thinly manned line, the silence broken only by the crunch of boots in snow and the distant rumble of trucks. Across the lines, in dimly lit bunkers, Adolf Hitler prepares one last desperate gamble. Germany's resources are dwindling, its cities bombed relentlessly, its armies battered on both eastern and western fronts. Yet Hitler refuses to accept inevitable defeat. He envisions a bold counter-offensive through the Ardennes, a region considered difficult terrain and therefore lightly defended. The objective is breathtakingly ambitious: break through Allied lines, cross the Meuse River, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and split British and American forces. Such a blow, he believes, could force a negotiated peace in the West, allowing Germany to concentrate entirely on the Soviet advance in the East. You feel the audacity of the plan, as German troops assemble quietly under cover of darkness. Tanks are camouflaged, radio silence enforced, fuel stockpiled with obsessive care. The attack depends on surprise and speed, much like earlier blitzkrieg operations. But this is not 1940. Germany's armoured divisions are depleted, its air force weakened, its fuel reserves perilously low. Even so, thousands of troops and hundreds of tanks prepare to surge forward through snowbound forests. Before dawn on December 16, artillery erupts across the Ardennes. The quiet sector you stood in moments before explodes into chaos. Shells tear through trees and trenches alike. American units, caught off guard, scramble to respond. Communications falter under the intensity of the barrage. German infantry and armour advance rapidly, exploiting confusion and thin defences. You move through smoke and shattered timber as the front buckles inward, creating a bulge in Allied lines that gives the battle its name. The initial success is startling. German forces capture key road junctions and encircle several American units. At places like Bastogne, surrounded paratroopers dig in and refuse surrender. Snow falls steadily, muffling sound but complicating movement. Supply shortages intensify on both sides. You trudge along icy roads clogged with vehicles, feeling the urgency of commanders racing to plug gaps before the breakthrough widens further. Hitler's calculation rests on several fragile assumptions. He believes Allied command is complacent and divided. He assumes weather will ground Allied aircraft, preventing effective air support. He counts on speed to compensate for dwindling resources. For a time, poor weather does indeed shield German advances from aerial attack. Clouds hang low, visibility minimal. Yet as days pass, Allied resistance stiffens. Reinforcements arrive. The encircled defenders at Bastogne hold out despite freezing temperatures and limited supplies. You stand inside a snow-covered foxhole as American soldiers endure bitter cold, their breath visible in the air. When German envoys demand surrender, the reply is defiant and brief. That refusal becomes emblematic of the battle's turning point. The German advance slows as logistical realities intrude. Fuel shortages force tanks to halt or be abandoned. Narrow forest roads become choke points vulnerable to counterattack. Then, the weather shifts. Clear skies open above the Ardennes, and Allied aircraft roar back into action. You watch as fighter bombers sweep down on German columns, strafing and bombing supply lines. The momentum that once seemed promising begins to unravel. The bulge in the line holds, but it does not break through to the Meuse. The ambitious objective of reaching Antwerp fades into impossibility. Casualties mount in brutal winter conditions. Frostbite and exhaustion claim nearly as many victims as bullets. Civilians in Belgian villages endure shelling and occupation once more. The offensive, intended as a decisive blow, becomes a draining struggle that Germany cannot sustain. By late January 1945, Allied forces have pushed the bulge back, restoring the front line at enormous cost. You feel the weight of the decision that launched this final gamble. Hitler had diverted precious reserves from the Eastern Front to mount the Ardennes offensive, weakening defences against the advancing Soviet army. The hope of splitting Allied forces and forcing negotiation was rooted in a belief that boldness could reverse strategic collapse. Instead, the offensive consumes remaining resources and accelerates Germany's exhaustion. In Berlin, the realization dawns slowly that the gamble has failed. The Western Allies, though shaken, remain unified. The Soviet advance from the east gathers unstoppable force. Germany now faces encirclement from both directions. You sense how desperation can distort judgment, how the refusal to acknowledge limits leads to choices that hasten decline. And yet, on the ground, the battle leaves enduring impressions. Soldiers remember the shock of the initial assault, the eerie silence before artillery thundered, the frozen forests lit by muzzle flashes. The Ardennes becomes a symbol of resilience for Allied forces and of tragic overreach for Germany. It demonstrates that even when victory seems close, complacency can invite surprise, and that surprise alone cannot compensate for depleted strength. As February approaches, snow begins to melt, revealing churned earth beneath. The front stabilizes, then advances steadily eastward. Germany's last major offensive in the west has ended. The twisted decision to gamble everything on one final strike has yielded only deeper losses. You stand once more among the quiet trees, now scarred by shellfire, and feel the echo of ambition colliding with reality. The forests hold memory in their frozen soil, of hope for reversal, of stubborn defence, of momentum regained at terrible cost. The war in Europe edges toward its conclusion, but not because of sudden breakthroughs or desperate gambits. Instead, it moves forward through relentless pressure and overwhelming material strength. As the wind rustles bare branches overhead, you carry with you the lesson of the Ardennes, that desperation can drive bold action, but bold action cannot conjure resources that no longer exist. The final throw of the dice has landed, and it has not altered the course set in motion months before. The road to Berlin lies open now, not because of one dramatic strike, but because the gamble meant to prevent it has failed in the cold, unforgiving forests of winter. You rise now into thin, blinding sunlight thousands of feet above a quiet Japanese city, the air inside the aircraft humming with steady mechanical confidence. It is August 1945, and the war in Europe has ended, but in the Pacific it grinds on with ferocious intensity. Island battles have been costly beyond imagination. Okinawa alone has claimed tens of thousands of lives. American planners study projections for a potential invasion of Japan's home islands and see casualty estimates so high they seem almost unreal. You stand in the cramped interior of a B-29 bomber as crew members check instruments with disciplined calm. Below, clouds drift over Hiroshima, a city largely untouched by the firebombing that has devastated others. It has been spared, some say, to measure something precisely. The decision that has brought you here began years earlier in secret laboratories under the Manhattan Project. Scientists in Los Alamos, Oak Ridge and Chicago laboured to harness atomic energy into a weapon of unprecedented destructive power. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the bomb was nearly complete. Some argued its use would demonstrate American dominance and hasten Japan's surrender without a bloody invasion. Others questioned the morality of unleashing such force on a city filled with civilians. President Harry S. Truman faced a choice layered with military, political, and ethical consequences. The calculus was stark: shock Japan into surrender swiftly, or prepare for an invasion that could cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. You watch as the Enola Gay approaches its target on the morning of August 6. At 8:15 a.m, the bomb is released. It falls silently for 43 seconds before detonating approximately 9,900 feet above the city. In that instant, a blinding flash engulfs Hiroshima. A fireball hotter than the surface of the sun expands outward, vaporizing structures and human bodies near ground zero. A shockwave follows, flattening buildings across miles. You feel the aircraft lurch as the blast wave catches it even at altitude. Below, a mushroom cloud rises, towering into the sky, its base churning with fire and debris. The destruction is immediate and catastrophic. Tens of thousands die within moments. Fires spread uncontrollably through shattered neighborhoods. Survivors stagger through ruins, burned and disoriented. You walk through streets reduced to ash and twisted steel, hearing only wind and distant cries. The scale of devastation defies comparison. No conventional bomb had ever wrought such concentrated destruction, yet Japan does not surrender immediately. Some leaders in Tokyo hesitate, debating whether the United States possesses more such weapons, or whether this was a singular anomaly. Military hardliners argue for continued resistance, believing that inflicting heavy casualties in a home defense might secure better surrender terms. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, honoring promises made at Yalta, declares war on Japan on August 8 and invades Manchuria, overwhelming Japanese forces there. The strategic picture shifts rapidly. On August 9, a second atomic bomb is dropped, this time on Nagasaki after cloud cover obscures the original target of Kokura. The explosion devastates another city, though its geography limits the scale compared to Hiroshima. Still, tens of thousands perish. You stand once more amid a landscape scorched into silence. The cumulative shock of 2 atomic detonations and the Soviet declaration of war fractures Japan's leadership debate. Emperor Hirohito intervenes, breaking precedent to urge acceptance of surrender terms outlined in the Potsdam Declaration. On August 15, 1945, his voice is broadcast to the nation for the first time, announcing Japan's surrender. Across the Pacific, celebrations erupt. The war that began years earlier with surprise attack ends with a weapon born of secret science and unimaginable force. You feel the gravity of the decision lingering long after the cheering fades. Supporters argue that the bombs prevented a prolonged invasion and saved countless lives. Critics contend that Japan was already nearing collapse due to blockade, conventional bombing, and impending Soviet invasion. The moral debate unfolds in universities, governments, and among survivors for decades to come. The use of atomic weapons reshapes not only the war's end, but the future of warfare itself. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the human cost becomes a lasting presence. Survivors, known as hibakusha, endure long-term effects of radiation sickness, cancers, and stigma. You walk through a hospital ward where patients struggle with burns and illnesses poorly understood at the time. The bomb's invisible legacy proves as haunting as its initial blast. Structures are rebuilt eventually, but memory persists in monuments and annual ceremonies of remembrance. The twisted decision here lies in crossing a threshold, in choosing to demonstrate power so absolute that it alters the moral landscape of conflict. Truman and his advisors weighed strategic urgency against ethical uncertainty. They feared that delay might embolden Japan's military faction or prolong suffering. They also understood that the Soviet Union's entry into the war complicated geopolitical calculations. Ending the war swiftly might limit Soviet influence in post-war Asia. Layers of strategy and diplomacy intertwined with the immediate objective of forcing surrender. As autumn approaches, American occupation forces land in Japan. You stand on a quiet Tokyo street as soldiers walk past civilians bowing cautiously. The Emperor remains on the throne, but under new constitutional constraints. The atomic age has begun. Nations around the world study the implications of nuclear weapons. Within years, the Soviet Union will detonate its own atomic bomb, igniting an arms race that casts a long shadow over global politics. You look back at that clear August morning and feel how swiftly centuries of warfare shifted. For millennia, battles were fought with blades, muskets, artillery, and planes. In seconds, a single device erased a city. The decision to use it did not emerge lightly, yet its consequences transcend the immediate war. It introduces a new calculus to international relations, one where deterrence rests on the threat of mutual annihilation. As you walk through Hiroshima months later, reconstruction underway, children playing near skeletal remnants of buildings left as memorials, you sense both resilience and sorrow intertwined. The war has ended, but a new era has begun, one defined by the knowledge that humanity can destroy itself with a flash of light brighter than the sun. The aircraft that carried the bomb has long since landed. The mushroom clouds have dissipated into ordinary sky, yet the choice to deploy atomic weapons reverberates through generations. It remains one of the most consequential and debated decisions in modern history, a moment when leaders chose shock and finality over drawn-out conflict, altering not only the outcome of World War II, but the very boundaries of possibility in warfare. As twilight settles over rebuilt streets, lanterns glowing softly in windows, you feel the hush that follows immense upheaval. The guns have fallen silent. The world inhales cautiously, aware that it has crossed into something irrevocably new. You stand in the quiet that follows surrender, a strange suspended stillness that feels almost unreal after years of thunder. Cities across Europe and Asia lie bruised and rebuilding, their skylines jagged against soft morning light. Soldiers return home carrying memories heavier than their packs ever were. Factories that once forged shells now produce refrigerators and cars, yet beneath this surface calm, you sense something unresolved, like embers buried beneath ash, waiting for the right gust of wind. The war has ended, but the decisions made during it have reshaped the world in ways that refuse to settle. In conference rooms at Yalta and Potsdam, leaders redraw maps with firm strokes of pencil. Germany is divided into occupation zones. Berlin itself is split like a fractured jewel at the centre of Europe. You walk through streets where Soviet and American soldiers once exchanged wary glances, their alliance forged in necessity, now thinning under suspicion. The Soviet Union, having borne staggering losses, tightens its grip over Eastern Europe, installing friendly governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and beyond. Western leaders speak of self-determination, Moscow speaks of security and buffer zones. Both remember invasions that came from across these same plains. Trust erodes quietly, not with artillery, but with policy and posture. You feel the tension in 1946 as Winston Churchill delivers a speech describing an iron curtain descending across the continent. The phrase lingers like frost on glass. It captures a new division not drawn by trenches but by ideology. On one side, capitalist democracies led by the United States. On the other, communist states under Soviet influence. The wartime alliance fractures into rivalry, shaped by mutual suspicion and competing visions of global order. The atomic bomb, once a secret weapon used to end a war, becomes the centerpiece of this emerging standoff. The United States initially holds a monopoly on nuclear weapons, but Soviet scientists, driven by urgency and espionage, detonate their own device in 1949. You stand in the Nevada desert as an American test lights up the sky, then years later in Kazakhstan as another flash signals parity. The world shifts from conventional arms races to something far more precarious. The doctrine of deterrence takes hold. Peace maintained not by trust, but by the certainty of mutual destruction. In 1948, Berlin becomes the first flashpoint of this new era. When Western allies introduce a new currency in their zones of Germany, the Soviet Union responds by blockading West Berlin, cutting off land access. You walk through streets where supplies dwindle and uncertainty grows. Rather than retreat, the Western powers launch an airlift, flying in food and fuel for nearly a year. Aircraft land every few minutes. their engines droning overhead like mechanical heartbeat. The gamble here is different, not an offensive strike, but a test of endurance and resolve. The blockade eventually lifts, but the division of Germany hardens. Across the Atlantic, the United States forms NATO in 1949, a military alliance promising collective defence. The Soviet Union counters with the Warsaw Pact years later. You sense how alliances once meant to deter aggression now solidify opposing blocs. The world organises itself around competing spheres of influence, each side wary of the other's intentions. The consequences of wartime decisions ripple into Asia as well. In China, civil war resumes between nationalists and communists after Japan's defeat. By 1949, Mao Zedong's communist forces prevail, establishing the People's Republic of China. The United States, having supported the nationalists, views this shift with alarm. Korea, divided along the 38th parallel after Japanese surrender, becomes another battleground in 1950, when North Korean forces invade the South. You stand amid the chaos of the Korean War, where United Nations troops led by the United States clash with North Korean and Chinese forces. The conflict ends not with victory, but with armistice, the peninsula still divided. Each of these flashpoints traces back to choices made in the crucible of World War II. The decision to divide Germany, to deploy atomic weapons, to expand spheres of influence, all shape a world defined by ideological rivalry rather than open global war. Yet the fear of nuclear annihilation hangs constantly in the background. You feel it most sharply during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba brings the United States and Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear exchange. For 13 days, the world holds its breath. Ships face off in tense waters, leaders exchange urgent messages. The memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki lingers heavily in every calculation. And yet, despite crises and proxy wars, direct confrontation between the superpowers never erupts into full-scale conflict. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, chilling as it is, acts as restraint. You stand beneath the quiet night sky, aware that missiles sit in silos across continents, capable of ending civilization in minutes. The twisted irony is that the most destructive weapons ever created may have prevented another world war. Meanwhile, decolonization accelerates across Africa and Asia, reshaping the global order. Former colonies assert independence, navigating between Cold War blocs or attempting non-alignment. Leaders like India's Jawaharlal Nehru seek a path outside the binary divide. The world grows more interconnected, yet more complex. As decades pass, the Cold War shifts from rigid hostility to cautious tenté. Arms control treaties attempt to limit nuclear stockpiles. Cultural exchanges and diplomatic visits soften edges slightly. Then in 1989 the Berlin Wall falls, crowds gathering with hammers and hope. You stand amid the jubilant throng as concrete barriers crumble. The Soviet Union itself dissolves 2 years later. The Cold War ends not with nuclear fire, but with political transformation. Yet the legacy of those earlier decisions persists. Nuclear weapons remain in arsenals. Alliances endure. Regions once divided still carry scars. The choices made in the heat of global war continue to echo, shaping policies and perceptions long after the original leaders have passed. Now, as you stand in the present moment, far removed from trenches and mushroom clouds, the air feels calmer. The world is imperfect, uncertain, but still here. The embers that once threatened to ignite total destruction glow faintly rather than fiercely. You realise how fragile that calm can be, how easily miscalculation could tip scales once more. So you let the tension soften in your shoulders. You picture those early mornings in Sarajevo, the muddy fields of France, the frozen plains of Russia, the burning skies over Japan. Each twisted decision carved its mark into history, yet humanity endured, adapted, rebuilt. The story is not one of simple doom, but of consequence and continuity. The night around you grows quieter. Cities hum softly instead of roaring with artillery. The rivers that once carried debris now reflect moonlight peacefully. You breathe in slowly, feeling the weight of history settle not as dread, but as awareness. And as you drift toward rest, you hold on to this, that even in the darkest chapters, choices matter. They shape the world in ways vast and subtle, and though the past cannot be undone, understanding it allows you to step more gently into tomorrow. Let the echoes fade now, let the maps fold closed. The journey through twisted decisions has brought you here, to a world still turning, still learning, still hoping, beneath a calm and watchful sky.